Hi there, Grant from Penguin Motors here. As you can see, our 1900 Xflow is pretty much complete now and ready for dyno testing. So in this video, we're going to bring you some of the stages it took to get you from the last video up to where we are now. So here we have the head back from having its seats cut. And there's a dummy. I've just installed the retainers and collets. With a straight edge, we can verify across the face of the valves, all the tips of the stems. We can just quickly verify the valve seats are all the same height. So what I actually want to do now is double check the spring fitted length, which for these Kent Springs VS7s should be 34mm. Numerous ways to do it. You can do it with a caliper in there like that. Alternatively, admittedly this is by eye, but I've got a vernier here. I've already set it to 34mm required. And we can just pop it there and visually verify it's the size we want. At this point, I just thought it'd be interesting to weigh a few pistons. So we have a standard 1600 piston, a 1300 piston that everyone says is a lot heavier, a Lotus twin cam piston, which back in the day we used to like to fit because it was nice and light, so the engines rev better, and a forged JA piston that's going in the 1900. And to do it, we're going to use a set of scales from our local post office. So, scales at the ready. The needle's not quite sitting on 0, but for our purposes that really doesn't matter. Up first, the standard 1600 piston, 455 grams. The allegedly much heavier 1300 piston, 460. That's not much different. The twin cam piston, oh, that's quite a saving. So that is 375 grams. And lastly, our big 85mm piston, JE forged. Oh, that's quite a bit different. 320 grams. So, stem seal, pop it on the guide, using a silk drift and a hammer. This is a gudgeon pin, but the socket works quite well. Gently tap it down. Don't whack it too much because it's easy to split the seal. Then I like to dip the end of the valve in a bit of grease. Grease has two purposes: lubricates the guide, gives the stem seal an easy ride on the way up. I don't like that, that didn't quite go square. I'm just going to give that a little tap. That's better, square. Then on with the valve spring. Retainer on top. Spring compressor. Now with these big old collets, you don't really need to. They're easy to fit by hand with your fingers. But if you're doing a modern engine with tiny little collets, a magnetic screwdriver is really good. And as you can see, the grease there held it. I'm just going to do the other side by hand. That's it. Job done. And lastly, I just like to make sure the valves are sealing. You could tip the head up and fill the pot with fluid. I use a mixie vac, and if I can suck a vacuum, then I know the valve is actually seating. Time to fit the pistons to the rods. Plenty of oil, all the moving surfaces. Pin, small end. Make sure the pin slides freely. If you're doing this in cold weather, you might actually have to warm the piston up slightly. But it wasn't cold when I did this, so it slides around easily. Right. Worst bit of the job is going to be put the circlips in. They don't like going in. But what I find with the first one is that I'll push it in, get it in there, get it in its hole. Don't worry too much about getting it in the groove. If it's in the hole and below the groove, even if it's at a really funny angle, which this is going in at 90 degrees to the bore, but don't worry, as long as I can get it in. It's in the hole, put the pin in and just push the pin in and the clip snaps into position. We then put the rod on and get the other clip in. Afraid there's no real easy way of doing that other than persevering and stabbing a few fingers on the way. So, fit the bearing cap. Next up, there's obviously the rod bolts, and here I'm just oiling the rod bolts. Now, these are ARP bolts. Something to note is that if you're going to tighten them with a torque wrench, you absolutely must use the correct 30-weight oil or ARP's own lube, done to a different setting. In this instance, I'm using plain engine oil because later on I'm going to stretch the bolts using a stretch gauge. Therefore, the lubricant is not critical. Here I'm just nipping the bolts up just so I can make sure that the crank rotates lovely, which it does. So having nipped up all the rod bolts, now they're all in, I need to loosen them off again because I don't want any stretch on the bolt at all. I want it just literally nipped up with no stretch. So now I can put the stretch gauge on, jiggle it around, it goes on both ends of the bolts, and set that to 0. The dial gauge is now 0. What have I done with my spanner? Alright, yeah, spanner found. I now put the spanner on and put the stretch gauge back on. And I tighten the rod bolt with the stretch gauge fitted. It's a bit fiddly, but I prefer it over using the other method, which is to measure the bolt length, torque it up to the specified amount, and then check the rod bolt has changed by the required amount. It's just easier, to my mind, just to torque them up. So they're stretched by about 6.5, 7 thou. That looks about right. I'll just take the gauge off, take the spanner off and recheck. Gauge back on, jiggle it around. Yeah, there we go, bang on. That's the rod bolt torqued up correctly. Here we go, super fast cam timing. What I actually did was use a positive stop to identify true TDC, and then DTI push rod on number 1 inlet valve, just to correct the cam timing. Although I'm going to swing it on the dyno, so I didn't really need to go to that extreme anyway. So what's going on here? Well, after running the tap down all the bolt threads, especially on an engine I don't know the history on, I always like to install all the bolts and check the height when they're just screwed in finger tight. And by checking the depth of the hole in the head, we can be sure that the bolts will properly clamp the gasket before they bottom out. So here we go, Cometic multi-layer steel gasket, ideal. Pops on the standard dowels lovely, and the head fits a treat. None of this messing around trying to make things fit and use spacers and dowels and things. Ford hardware works perfectly. So we just need to lubricate the head bolts, in this case standard bolts, nice bit of oil, and I'm going to torque them down in several stages with a good weight in between. Here we have a close-up of number 1 exhaust valve and the rocker arm assembly and the shaft sitting on its steel post. And at first glance it looks perfectly normal, but in actual fact it's quite wrong. The rocker sits level, and that's not ideal, because when the valve's shut you really want the rocker at the valve end to be slightly uphill, so that when it works the valve it does it in something of rocking motion and inputs the least amount of thrust angle into the valve stem and where's the guide. If I turn the engine over, you'll get a better idea of why it's so wrong. So there we go. There we go. As I've turned the engine over, you can now see the rocker arm is wiping on the very tip, very edge of the rocker, which is going to wear things out badly. So what we need to do, we need to reduce the rocker post height. So after shortening the rocker post several times, and in the end I took approximately about 2mm off, this is where we ended up. With the valves on the cylinder shut, as you can see, the rocker is now pointing upwards, and if we rotate the engine, instead of the rocker just working on the very tip, it's now rolling across the face of the valve. One handy tip for checking wear and geometry is colour the surfaces in with a permanent marker, or engineer's blue, but in this instance I couldn't find my engineer's blue, so permanent marker, once it dries, works just as well. And here we have the marking on two valves. This one here, the inlet, is actually a representation of what I had on this valve before we adjusted the rocker pillars. I meant to take a picture but didn't, I forgot. If we look at the rockers, this one, which is again another representation because I forgot to take a picture, was the wear pattern on the face of the rocker before the shaft assembly was shortened, and next to it an actual one from afterwards. And you can see on this one the rocker was working right off the very tip. That would have worn the rocker and the valves very quickly. So other than to take a hammer to the sump and beat out the front of the well to clear the crank webs and actually bolt the valve gear down and do the tappets, that's pretty much it for this this video. And on the next one we should be on the dyno. So you ready to make some noise, boys? Catch you in the next episode.